Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Democracy and Standards meeting on a wonderful 13th. Sorry? Right, okay. Thank you for joining us. Right, the only apologies I have are Kirk Harrison, and apart from that, I believe we are complete. Are there any members' declarations of interest under item 2? Councillor Watts? Oh, sorry.
Yes, it's just a minor thing. I was on the planning board that made the recommendations that we're considering in item number 4.
What is your view, please?
I think it's absolutely fine. As long as you're coming with an open mind and you're going to debate the issues in front of you tonight, then that's absolutely fine.
Thank you. Councillor Mercer?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have the same declaration to make, and I can guarantee you that my mind is open.
Thank you. Is there anybody? Councillor Watts?
I'm Chair of Corby Area Planning and Vice Chair of Scrutiny.
But you come here with an open mind. Sort of open. Councillor Maxwell?
Well, I come with an open mind, but I'm also Chair of Planning for Earthling Borough.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Buckingham?
I too sit on the Corby Planning Board, but I have a very open mind.
Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Fedorovich?
Yeah, just to note that I sit on the Kettering Planning Committee, and again, open-minded.
Sorry. Yep, thank you.
I'm on the planning committee for Kettering as well.
Okay. Councillor Jill Mercer?
I'm on the area planning for Thrapston as well. I have an open mind.
Thank you. I'm on the planning I make my own. I'm on the planning committee, the area planning committee in Wellington, and I've got a very open mind. Councillor Addison.
Just to make it a full set, Chair, I'm also on Corby Planning Committee.
Thank you. So I think from that, Councillor Ty.
I've got a loud voice. Madam Chairman, I'm a substitute on the planning committee, so that's the only interest I've got.
But you're here with an open
But I thought
mind.
I ought to declare it because I'm an honest man.
Thank you. We recognise that. Councillor Andy Mercer.
I think I need to add to my earlier declaration that I'm also a member of the Thrapston Area Planning Committee.
Thank you. So with that, have you got any? You're the only one, you're the odd one out now.
Thanks, Chair. I'm also a substitute on the Corby Planning Committee.
Thank you. So I get that we all are here with an open mind and no predetermination in any shape or form. Thank you very much. With that, I would like to turn to item 3, the approval of the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of January 2023. Are there any comments or can we take them as approved? Anybody? No? With that, can I have a show of hands that you approve the minutes? Thank you. Anybody against? Anybody abstaining? You didn't vote, Councillor Ty.
I can't hear you very well. My ears need syringing and I can't get an appointment until the middle of next month.
Okay. If I speak louder, will that help you?
Pardon? I'm only teasing you, sorry. No,
I know you are.
Fine.
I will make sure that I'll speak closer to the microphone, that you can hear us. Thank you. And if you switch yours off, you can even hear better then. Okay, thank you. So we have the approval of the minutes. I presume you were voting with that, or do we just... That's fine then. No problem. Okay. They are approved with this. Item 4, the proposed amendments to the planning scheme of delegation and committee structure. And welcome to Mr. Harbour and also Mr. Candler. I presume that you are introducing your own report. Thank you. Platform is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, members. So the purpose of the report tonight is to consider amendments to the planning schema delegation and committee structure, which are a response to the Planning Advisory Service peer review, which took place in September of last year. So the PAS peer review occurred at the back end of September last year. It was a review which was invited by the leader of the council, and through the period of the review undertook a series of stakeholder engagement sessions with a wide variety of different stakeholders of the planning service. The outcome of that was a report which was considered by this council's executive in December of last year, and within the report there were 13 recommendations from PAS in relation to the transformation of the planning service. In response to the peer review report and recommendations, the council drafted an action plan, and that was also considered by executive in December and approved as such. So, along with the proposed amendments that are before you tonight, I suppose just to set a wider context, there is a large amount of other transformation work being undertaken across the planning service. Some of that work is around issues to do with performance, engagement, training for officers and support for officers in terms of mentoring and professional development, and a lot of work around improving the efficiency of back office processes. As you'll be aware, at the point of vesting day, we brought together 5 local planning authorities into North Northamptonshire, the 4 district and borough, former sovereign authorities, and also the former county councils, minerals and waste planning service. So, as you'll appreciate, as a result of that, 5 local planning authorities into 1 is a significant amount of work, and there is a large programme of transformation activity taking place. This is just one element of it, but nonetheless an extremely important one. So to, I suppose, go to the recommendations of the PAS peer review in terms of scheme of delegation and committee structure, PAS made a number of recommendations in that respect. And those are that we seek to ensure that householder and minor applications only go to committee in exceptional circumstances, that we trial a significantly reduced number of committees with a proportional geographic spread, and that to encourage the move to a new joined-up planning service, that we seek to set up new committee boundaries so that they're not aligned with predecessor council boundaries. So they were the key recommendations that came out of the PAS peer review. And in the action plan approved by executive in December, the 2 actions relating to this were that we review the planning scheme of delegation and the development of an amended scheme based on best practice and supported by NNC planning data, and that we also review the planning committee system and the development of proposals for a revised committee structure, also supported by planning data, that optimises the efficiency and enables committees to focus on the most significant applications. So, off the back of the peer review and action plan, one of the first actions that was undertaken was to set up a planning transformation board, which includes 8 members, chaired by the Executive Lead Member for Growth and Regeneration, Councillor Brackenbury. And that met a number of times during January and February, during which proposals were considered for amendments to the scheme of delegation and the committee structure. In order to support the consideration of those proposals, work was undertaken to look at the NNC Planning Committee data, and some of that's available for you in the report tonight. So Table 1, for example, at 4.9, illustrates the number of committee meetings that took place, but also the number of meetings which were cancelled or where the committee was held but only considered a single agenda item on this. At 4.11 in the report, Table 2 looks more specifically at the applications which were triggered to go to committee as a result of an unresolved representation made by a town or parish council. I will come on to the importance of that in a second. And we also undertook work in terms of benchmarking against other unitary authorities. So what we were able to present to members of the Planning Transformation Board were not only the recommendations of PAS, but also some data which helped to support some of PAS's findings, and also some benchmarking information in relation to other high-performing unitary authorities. So, in terms of the scheme of delegation, PAS identified a couple of key issues that they felt affected performance. One of those was the ability for town and parish councils to effectively dictate when applications would go through to committee as a result of the trigger within the current scheme of delegation, and secondly, undue weight being given to the number of objections. So we looked at the data in relation to that, and that's the data that you'll see in Table 2. In fact, in terms of the second of the PAS observations around undue weight being given to number of objections, the data and benchmarking that we undertook didn't actually support that finding, and therefore it wasn't taken forward in terms of proposals to the Planning Transformation Board. However, the assertion around the Town and Parish Council trigger, sending stuff to committee, data did seem to support that. As you can see in Table 2, 61% of all applications considered by committee over 2021 and 22 were as a result of a town or parish council triggering the application going to committee as a result of an unresolved representation. So quite a significant proportion of applications being considered by committee make their way through to that process as a result of a town or parish council unresolved objection. So in terms of benchmarking, we originally looked at 10 unitary authorities, but then actually narrowed that down to 7 whose performance was as good or better than North Northamptonshire's. And you can see that in the table at Table 3 at 4.14. And what you'll see from that table are the green cells are where performance is better than North Northamptonshire's, red is where it's not as good. And therefore, off the basis of that, we discounted the 3 unitaries at the bottom of the table, but we did include in benchmarking exercise the 7 unitary authorities at the top of the table. From that benchmarking, we were able to ascertain some information about their schemes of delegation. And what we could conclude from that were that actually no one's schemes of delegation entirely matched each other. They all have certain things in common, as some have more things in common than others. So, for example, all 7 schemes of delegation, like North Northamptonshire's, include within it a trigger around there being a departure from the development plan or significant implications to it, and they also all included a ward member call-in facility as well. As we move down through other trigger points that we have within our scheme of delegation, we then move into a situation where a certain number of them might share that trigger, but certainly not all of them. And we focus in, I think, specifically on the issue of town or parish councils, where you can see 3 out of the 7 have a trigger which is the same as North Northamptonshire's. 1 has an alternative trigger where actually town and parish council trigger is restricted to major applications only, and the other 3 out of the 7 just don't have that trigger within it at all. In terms of the work of the Planning Transformation Board, over the course of several meetings, there were a number of options which were considered, including the complete removal of the trigger for town and parish councils, and also statutory consultees. And the reason statutory consultees entered into the debate was, you'll see at 4.15 that very few other schemes out of the benchmarking included the same trigger for representations, for unresolved representations from a statutory consultee. Only 2 out of the 7 unitary authorities actually include that trigger in there. So it's something where actually that benchmarking would indicate that North Northamptonshire's current scheme is perhaps slightly unusual in terms of the majority of other unitaries that we looked at. So we looked at whether or not we should remove those triggers completely, whether or not we should seek to put some constraints around those triggers. For example, consideration was given to whether or not we could perhaps make it mandatory for a representative of a town or parish council or statutory consultee to appear at a planning committee if it was that trigger that actually meant that the committee had to consider the application. However, after considering a number of options such as those, the Planning Transformation Board concluded that I suppose the best solution was to amend the scheme of delegation so that the trigger relating to unresolved objections, whether that be town or parish council or a statutory consultee, only related to major applications. The reason for that, going back to the original work by PAS, was that PAS were quite clear, and if we go back to their original recommendations, they were quite clear that they felt that the committees should ensure that householders and minor applications only go to committee in exceptional circumstances, and they also say within their observations that committees should focus their attention on considering only the most significant applications, along, of course, with any which involve councillors or planning staff as the applicant. So we arrive, as a consequence of the work of the Planning Transformation Board, with 2 recommendations around the amendments to the scheme of delegation, those that I've just described. They were then taken forward to Constitutional Working Group, where further consideration was also given to those proposed amendments, and those amendments were supported and therefore appear in the report before you tonight. Moving on from the scheme of delegation to the planning committee structure, you'll be aware that at the moment the authority operates 5 planning committees. That's a strategic planning committee and 4 area planning committees on a monthly cycle. So that's 5 committees every month. PAS concluded from their report that the costs of taking applications to committee are much higher than delegated decisions, that committees should consider only the most significant applications, and that an excessive number of householder and minor applications are being considered by committee, and that the governance arrangements that we have in place around committees are not efficient or effective for a unitary authority of this scale. So we again looked at data and we benchmarked against those 7 unitary authorities that I described to you earlier on. The outcome of that, as you can see from the tables, are that in 2022, 48% of our committees were either cancelled or met to consider a single application. When we benchmarked against the other 7 high-performing unitary authorities, we found that 6 out of those 7 authorities operated with a single planning committee on a monthly basis. Only 1 authority operated with 2 subcommittees. However, a third of those committees only considered a single application in 2022. So, to a large extent, replicating exactly what's happening in Northamptonshire and the issue that Paz highlighted around the inefficiency of the current system. As you would imagine, we considered at the Planning Transformation Board alternative options around committees, including the proposal of a single committee. However, at the end of several meetings, it was considered that a 2-committee structure was probably the best solution that would ensure that actually committees were less likely to be cancelled because there will be more business being put through each of those committees, but at the same time that those committees wouldn't be so overloaded, overburdened with work that in actual fact the committees would have sufficient capacity to be able to give due regard and consideration to the applications that were brought before them. So the committee structure of 2 committees, further consideration was given to the geographic area, and I'll take you back to one of the recommendations from PAS, and that was to look at a geographical split of Northamptonshire that didn't replicate the former authority areas, and you'll see, hopefully within your appendices, a map of the proposed committee structure, the geographic areas for a proposed new committee structure of 2 committees, which, although in part follows some of the former geographic area, certainly does not on whole, and therefore very much kind of splits the former East Northamptonshire area into 2 parts. So I'll refer to those as North and South. You'll note within that plan that actually the 2 geographic areas don't by land mass look equal, but we also did further work looking at the amount of planning work generated out of each of the former authority areas, and actually that would indicate that the split as you see it there is probably as likely to provide a 50-50 split of work across those two committees as we could get following a ward boundary line between the two committees. That will never be an exact science, and of course we're using historic data to predict the future, and you can never be 100% certain of what the future will look like, but it's the best indicator that we can find in that respect. So the proposals that are before you tonight are the amendment to the scheme of delegation, and the proposed amendments are before you in Appendix A, and a revised planning committee structure and the terms of reference that accord to that committee structure, which you'll see in Appendix B, which sets out the geographic split of those two committees, and Appendix C are a proposed set of amendments to planning committee terms of reference. So the recommendation, Chair, is for committee to recommend to full council that the proposed amendments to the planning scheme of delegation as set out in Appendix A, the planning committee structure be amended to two committees as set out in Appendix B, and that the terms of reference be amended as set out in Appendix C. I'll leave it, I think, at that point, Chair, as a sort of an introductory speech to the report, but obviously happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harbour, for that detailed introduction of your report. Before I open this up to the committee, I have got some questions myself. In Table 1 and 2, it would have been helpful if we had some indication on the total number of villages involved, because that changes the figure completely. I remember in the working group when we looked at it, and we had, say, for instance, in Table 2, 88 Thrapston area applications. Thrapston is one of the highest areas of villages, so I would expect a lot of them to be calling in or something. But when I then turn to the appendix, unfortunately my appendix isn't numbered, it's page 29 of the report. When I now look at the split, south and north, the old East Northants area with the largest amount of villages is actually contained together with Kettering and Corby. How will that reflect if there are so many? Because obviously the parishes still have the opportunity via the ward councillor to call it in, and so they should. But you have a high concentration of villages who no doubt will do that. I've also had several emails, because I wasn't aware, and probably nobody in this committee was aware, that there was a presentation already to parish councils and town councils, and that prompted a number of emails to me. And initially I didn't quite understand how they knew, because it was almost before this report was published. And they expressed their concern that some of them don't have monthly meetings. How will that reflect if, for instance, they have 2-3 weeks later, they have a committee meeting or parish council meeting? By then, the consultation period has ended. How can they work with that? The other great concern they have, and I had emailed an officer and I did get no response so far, do they get the weekly list of planning applications will going forward as well? Because then the clerks, some of the parish clerks said they can pick it up from there and then inform their parish council, but it doesn't change how much time is left for parish council to object if they have a genuine material or substantial objection and speak to their ward councillor. And you may have a ward councillor, one ward councillor will say, yeah, I'll do this, and the other one says, no way. How do you deal with that? That has not been reflected in the thoughts, I feel, in the report. But those are just my own comments. And with that, I open it up to the committee. The first one is Councillor Maxwell and then Councillor Andy Mercer.
Well, I'd like to just illustrate a point, actually. I brought this along, this board, to show you what I do when I do a planning application meeting in Earthlinborough. Now, we actually only got 2 days for this, and this is massive. And you expect us to actually discuss this application in sort of like 2 days and then give a decision on the third day. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes we don't get the applications for planning until the day beforehand. And we do have a meeting quite frequently for planning. But the fact is, what I'm saying is, from the residents' point of view, how they're supposed to actually understand or even discuss it, let alone the actual councillors on the actual planning meeting. And I just think personally, you haven't really taken that into account. You just assume that we all actually arrive with the applications a week beforehand. This week, tomorrow, we're discussing applications which came in on Friday. It's just not long enough. You're just sort of like, and again, it's not democratic, because how do the residents actually have a say? They don't. They just assume that we, the councillors, make a decision for them. But we like to tell residents exactly what's going on. It's not, it doesn't really stack up. And I think personally, this application, which was actually turned down by the residents and the officers a couple of years ago, illustrates that point. Now it's come back again because the inspector, who didn't come to Earthlinborough, he looked online and had a look. He didn't really see exactly the actual space that we're talking about. And he's just said, yes, go ahead. But it's not feasible. You see, people have got to have time to discuss applications, and equally, they've got to have time to think how they're going to move it around. And I just feel that your report, personally, just doesn't add up to this. And making us 2 sites, 2 different areas, you've actually got our area, which was in Thrapston. We come to Thrapston out of it. But I think personally, I think it's just too much. I think having two actual planning meetings right across Northants Council is, for some people, it's like, I don't know where you're going to have the 2 meetings, but the fact is they're having to travel to get to these things. And then we have to notify the residents exactly where they are. So I feel personally that your report, I have read it quite extensively, and I just think that it's about a democratic society and residents having a say. And that's how we've actually worked before. And I think you don't quite realise that we are very open-minded, but at the present moment for the past year, it's been a bit, what I would say, chaotic, in so much that we don't always get the information till, as I said, till the last minute. And when we do get the information, we haven't got time to discuss it with the residents. And Earthlinborough is quite I'd say quite a big town, actually. It's not little. And whereas I also have 5 villages. Now, in the 5 villages, one of them meets every other month, because it's only a little village, and the other villages don't meet. They meet after the planning meeting, so they haven't had time to discuss it. I just think that it's not really thought out about the fact that when we do get to meet to discuss it, it's too late. The meeting's happened. And so therefore we haven't been able to go along. And you were saying about the fact that we'd be able to go along to the meetings to give our views.
Are you coming to an end, Councillor Maxwell? Because I'm sure there are lots of other questions as well. Thank you very much for your comments. Are you able to answer anything, Mr. Harbour? Or just noting the comments?
I wonder perhaps whether, Chair, I note some of the comments and then try to sort of come back on block.
That would be helpful. Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was on the Planning Transformation Board, but I'm coming to this with an open mind, which means I'm thinking again from scratch. Now, I also went to one of the meetings with the PAS, and I disagreed quite strongly with several of their representatives. In particular, I'll note the comment, PAS recommends only the most significant applications, along with any that involve the council, councillors or planning staff as the applicant, should be considered by committee. I disagree fundamentally with that. You should also include the controversial applications. It's the controversial ones that get the council into problems. It's the controversial ones that the public, after all, we are their representatives, care about. So that I fundamentally disagree with. They've got that wrong. Now, as a consequence of that, there are a number of other things that follow where I'm not totally happy.
Okay.
Now, it affects the scheme of delegation, because if you're going to include controversial ones, then you end up with a slightly different scheme of delegation. Now, I will mention a couple of issues. Well, I'll go through the comments, starting with Appendix A. The first block, bullet point 4, applications that the relevant planning officer considers are potentially contentious. That's the first starting point. If it's contentious, it's local knowledge that tells you it's contentious. The planning officer is not going to have the same level of knowledge as the councillors, in particular the chair and vice chair. I therefore believe that it should not be the relevant senior planning officer who considers it to be potentially contentious. It should be the chair or vice chair, because they are the people who have got the local contacts. And then when you've got the word and, that should be or raise material planning issues. Right, so that's the first thing which follows from that initial comment. Right, now the biggest one is on page 27 near the bottom. This is where it says, the request shall be considered by the chair or vice chair of the relevant planning committee in consultation with the senior planning officer, and upon agreement that the referral contains material planning issues, the application shall be called in. Once again, it doesn't include controversial. So I would like to see that reworded as, the request shall be considered by the chair or vice chair of the relevant planning committee, and if the application is considered controversial or it has material planning issues, then it shall be called in. So the idea is, in both cases, both of these changes, to include controversy as well as significance, because controversial ones are the ones that trip us up. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Councillor Jean Addison.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's the first time I'm in agreement with Councillor Mercer.
Yippee.
I think that with the shadow council, it was agreed that we would have the 4 area planning committees. And I think the fear was of councillors was that if we went down to 2, that we would lose that local knowledge, you know, and that was the point at that time. Yes, we do need to be more efficient, and I totally agree with that. However, I'm not entirely confident with the planning department at the moment that there's enough officers that have that local knowledge. And I know I can only speak for Corby that we've had several planning applications come forward which have been controversial. And I think it's very important that the public see that we are actually listening to what they have to say. If it just goes through on the nod, if you like, through planning officers, the public haven't got the opportunity to speak and to have their views known. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think that's very much alongside what Councillor Andy Mercer proposed with that sentence change, because it is important that the public knows that we are fair and a clear understanding how it is actually decided whether it's a controversial application or not, and that information needs to be clearer. Are there any other? Councillor Fedorovic.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question to start off. I don't know if that could be answered before I get into my comments, but it was just about the theoretical splitting of the committees and who would sit on them, and essentially would it be sort of half and half from respective wards? Sorry if that's already been sort of answered, but I don't know if I could get clarity on that before I just dig in.
Okay. And did you want to...
if I could just get an answer and then I'll go on, because it informs kind of
Would it be possible, or do you want to
Chair,
wrap
I
that
just
up
refer to the terms of reference in Appendix C, which set out the principles of committee membership.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Right, so in terms of 4.8, I wanted to note about the fact that Paz mentioned about the undue weight is given to the number of objections. I don't agree with this. If anything, the opposite has seemed to be true in my experience recently. Last year, we increased the threshold for the number of objections and bring this to committee. And since that, we have now seen meetings be cancelled in Kettering. So my concern is that, and I have raised this already, that the threshold is too high, and that I've even had a particular instance in Kettering where the number of threshold objections was reached, but it wasn't counted because some of them were from the same household. So whereas we're still meeting that threshold, that was discounted. It showed it was a highly, again, this comes back to controversy, and I completely agree with Councillor Mercer's point about that. So the other side of this is obviously the improved efficiencies. From my perspective and the climate perspective, we are halving carbon footprint by halving these meetings. So from that perspective, I've got a vested interest to support that sort of move and the improved efficiencies there. But ultimately, the fact that we're removing a trigger from town and parish councils when their unresolved objection is material and effectively allows their voices to be heard, I don't think that's the right way to go. Whilst they might not always be acted upon by NNC, they're also very, very valuable still, and that is, especially if we're moving to two numbers of committees, you'll essentially be moving away that local knowledge, which is essentially what the town and parish councils bring to that. So it makes them even more important if you actually move to that. So I also wanted to highlight the fact that 87% of Kettering applications accepted the officer's recommendations, not the... so if you're averaging it out, it sort of doesn't look quite as significant, but in Kettering, actually, that wasn't the case. So it was only 87% that went through. So, I mean, ultimately for me, we've already reduced the number of objections it takes to call in the application to committee, so removing democracy from planning even more, I completely agree. We need to be really careful with this and make sure that people have that say, and we can feed that local opinion through, whether that be town councils and sort of on the lower level that you can feed that through potentially, but that's sort of my view on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Jill Mercer.
Thank you. With the tables, I think it would have been quite useful to know the number of applications that are sitting in the wings, because I'm not sure, how many are not being brought to committee at the moment at all, or being resolved under delegated. Now, we've had some meetings cancelled, but I'm not sure if that's as a result of there not being business, or they're just not ready because of the capacity of the staff. agree with Councillor Fedorovich about the 87% in Kettering of the town council ones that have been agreed. But that does mean that 13% were not, which is quite high. And I also think that just because it's come to committee and the resolution is the same, either grant or refuse, that doesn't mean to say that the committee hasn't had a good input into things like the conditions and, you know, maybe strengthening those or amending them. I do think also that although we're comparing to other councils, we actually have a very good record on one of the measures, which is the number of the appeals. I'm not sure that is a particularly good measure, but it's obviously the governance measure. And we are one of the best in that, so I don't think we should, not realise that. The other thing is that moving away from the locality of moving, having those two meetings, two areas, it's the public speakers as well as the committee. It's not the public's not mentioned anywhere in the report, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. I don't think that changes what we do, but I think we really have to acknowledge that. Our measure of success, I think, should not be things like that. It should be our satisfaction, the satisfaction of the residents. I know you can't always win planning, this always winner and a loser, but it's not just material, it's not just money. I very much agree with the contentious issues that my other half mentioned in terms of the first section of Appendix A. I'm a little concerned about, the town and parish councils having less representation. At Thrapston we have had a lot of them, but they are also able to bring it to the ward members, so that does slightly offset that. But we do have an issue sometimes where if a officer is minded to grant an application, the other way around, refuse an application, but the members think that it should be granted, it's very difficult to call it in, because we have to provide material planning issues. Now, there may not be a material planning issue. We may be saying, well, actually, I don't think that there is an issue. So I just wonder whether we ought to amend that section to something like at the end, or where the relevant officer is minded to refuse the application and the NNC councillor disagrees. Just because, people always think councillors want to turn everything down, whereas the officers are saying grant and we want to refuse. It's sometimes the other way around. I've countless examples in the past. So I just think we need to be minded of that. I think the contentious bit will perhaps help with that if it is a contentious there's an issue there. The other thing, I don't know whether we're going on to discussing the Appendix C at this very minute, possibly. The number of councillors on the committee, I just wonder, a vast area, people have, know their locality, they don't know across the area. So I'm just wondering whether 11 is sufficient, that maybe we need to go to 13, listen to other people. And on the quorum on that, we had an issue the other day with the Constitution Working Group where the quorum was said it should be 5 or whatever it is, but we tried to equalise that recently, and I can't remember exactly how we came down, but on the scrutiny one, I know we have changed it. So I just wonder if we ought to perhaps consider that, where it says 5, whether that is a quarter with a minimum of so many, and to make it equal because we had some at 5, some at 3, and it was all over the place. So we tried to get them equal. It didn't necessarily match what I thought it should be, but I think they ought to be, in line with each other.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell.
Well, I'd like to bring up on page 27. So, where the delegated authority should not be exercised when the application has been called in, the following criteria shall be met. Now, the NNC ward councillor shall submit the request in writing, setting out material planning issues. The request shall be received by the relevant senior planning officer within 21 days from the date of the application was first published. Now, we, as ward members, don't know when the actual applications come in. I mean, they might be 3 months behind. We don't know. We don't know when these applications actually physically arrive in the office. So how are we supposed to be able to do that? The other issue is also that when you get a large application, and I'm talking about really large application, it does take time actually to digest it. I just think when you send it through to the actual parishes or towns, the actual application, they operate differently in so much that they don't send that out to the councillors. They don't send it out to the councillors in that particular parish. So it could be Woodford, and they just get one sheet of paper and discuss it, and everybody looks at it, and that's it. I mean, it's not really, it's like passed around. But what I'm saying is, from the ward councillor point of view, we aren't getting the information coming down the line ourselves to actually look at it thoroughly. I think that's something that definitely would need looking at. Now, whether that's a fact that, because things have changed now. I don't think it's as open as it used to be. But at the end of the day, as ward councillors, if we're going to work with the residents, which is what we're supposed to be doing, because that's why we're elected to come and do so, then we need to discuss these applications with them. That's fundamental. Thank you.
I agree with you. 21 days isn't sufficient, especially for the parishes but they have their parish council or town council meetings at different intervals, and there are very, very many who will fall between the cracks, so to speak, and that isn't really fair either. Perhaps later on, perhaps you can clarify for me whether it's a statutory duration, 21 days, or whether there is an option to actually slightly extend that to allow the parishes and town councils to respond to the applications in the appropriate way, and to let ward councillors, if there is a request to call it in, or it's not the right term, it's to request it to go into committee rather than a call-in. And there should be some option, unless it is a statutory requirement of 21 days. Perhaps if you can later on, if you could answer that for me. Councillor Buckingham.
Thank you. And for me, as I said at the working group, for me it's about openness and transparency, and making sure that we do things in a timely manner, so that we're aware of what's going on, because our residents will come to us and say, well, that went through on a nod, where was that? Missed that one. So it has got to be that, not just about how we plan it now, but, that we, as I said at the time, bringing up that what has been delegated and why, so that we have those things that sort of go on behind, so you can say to, well, this was the reason why. So we've got something after as well as before. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Nichols.
Thank you. I wanted to ask what consideration had been made to potentially rotating the meetings between their respective new planning areas. I mean, I look at the the Corby and Frapston one, for instance, and I think there's a lot of potential to spread the meetings out to more people and more residents as possible. If you rotate the meetings, I think that could be quite a good consideration and get people out there, and it'll bring residents out who want to speak on planning applications. So if there hadn't already been, I just wanted you to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to bring up a slightly different side of these things. The proposed quorum is 5 voting members. I am very uncomfortable with that, and I'll explain why. Planning is the single most emotional issue that most councillors get involved in. And occasionally councillors have threats against them. On one occasion I've had to have police protection because of a planning decision. If you've got a small number of people on the committee and small quorum, then it's possible for unpleasant people to threaten councillors. When you've got a significantly larger number, it's more difficult. So 5 as the quorum strikes me as being what I think Sir Humphrey would call a brave decision minister. But sooner or later, if you have the quorum that small, someone is going to regret it. So for that reason, I would strongly recommend 7 as the minimum, and if you're going to raise the quorum to 7, the size of the committee would have to go up to 13 reasonably from 11. Now bear in mind we have currently 5 committees. Well, I think is it 7 or 8, something like that. 9? Is it 9 per committee?
It's 9 on the area committees.
That's 36, and it's how many on the strategic?
13.
That makes 49. So we've currently got 49 memberships of these committees. With 11 on each of these 2 area ones, that's 22. So we're cutting in the number of committee members by more than half. I can't see how going to 13, which brings you up to 26, which is about halfway, is that bad. But it gives you that little bit extra protection for members of the committee when they face a really difficult situation. I, for one, for instance, have had to arrange the desks in a room in a zigzag and get a police officer there to protect us. It's not funny. It's an unpleasant situation. We've had things thrown at us in the past from visitors' galleries like that. If you've only got a small number of councillors, you're in a very vulnerable position.
Thank you, Councillor Mercer. Mr. Gold.
Yeah, just for clarity, obviously there are some dual hatters in there who sit on both area and strategic, just to point that out. But the other point I was going to make is you also obviously have to allow for substitute members, which are particularly important as well. So when you're thinking about numbers, also think about substitute members in terms of how many would need to be allocated, how many trained up, etc., etc.
Thank you. I actually think that in Appendix C, 11 councillors is too much. I think it should be lower. We are struggling already with all the committees to find members who want to sit there, because remember, there will also be substitutes that have to be trained up as well, and there will be special training for all those. We had the reassurance of that in our Constitution Working Group. And
well, in that case, Madam Chairman, can I suggest that we raise the quorum if we're going to allow substitutes, because it's more easy to achieve a quorum if you've got substitutes around. But the quorum is the thing that scares me, being as low as 5.
So you're suggesting 7 members as a quorum? Yes. Okay. But I don't think 11 members should be in the committee. I think it should be lower, because there will be experts in the different areas. And remember, in 2 years' time, we're going down to 70 councillors. We struggle at the moment already. How is that going to work at that point? But that's just my personal view. Councillor Jill Mercer.
Yeah, we're only going down from 78 to 70. I think the fact that we're struggling to find people may be the case in some areas. It may not be everywhere. I think if you've got 9 members at the moment, covering, say, a quarter, if you like, of the area each, they'll more or less know their area. Whereas if you've got 9 covering twice the area, they're not going to know the area. I can't see that going to 9, I mean, Thrapston under East Northants Council, we had 18 members on the committee because we tried to get one from each little ward. You know, okay, we don't want to go to that sort of extreme, but I certainly think that 11 would be, you know, certainly not too many, and in fact, as suggested earlier, even increasing that to 13. You need to be able to get some local knowledge, and these are vast areas. Even taking out all the sort of villages from the area of, say, what was the East Northants one, you've then got to cover all the way down to the south and across to the west. So it is still a vast area, and what hasn't been mentioned is things like site visits. If you want to do a site visit, you know, it's quite considerable. I'd just like to agree with Councillor, all right, mine's Buckingham, about getting a list of the items that have gone through as delegated, because if we are going to delegate more items, people have said to me in my town, well, what's happening about this item? I don't know. I have to ask the question, and then I get, oh, yeah, that was decided, or that was refused, or that was granted. I have no idea what's going on, and I think that's a bad thing. We get the weekly list of items coming in, but sometimes they can take years or certainly many months to come to fruition. So I really think that we ought to have a list of the items, you know, what the outcome is of them, so that members can then take that on board and then look into it a bit more. You can't keep looking at the list because there's just too many applications to look for.
Thank you, Councillor Mercer. I agree that we really, if you could explain to us how you will keep members, or how the planning officers will keep members up to date on any application that has come in, and how we can, as individuals, transparently influence whether it's controversial or something, because otherwise it is just left to an officer and it's not transparent enough. If you could, later on, if you could add that to your long list, please, an explanation on that. Is there anybody? Oops, sorry, Councillor Watt.
Thanks. I agree with all the comments about local knowledge. Local knowledge is so important, especially with the kind of turnover of officers that we have within planning. And so to paraphrase what's been said, too many council meetings because there's not enough objections. We'd like to reduce further the number of objections, though. I think the parish removal from the parish councils, ward members are just going to call them in, so there won't be any change there. It says here, costs of taking to committee are much higher. Now, I would have thought a report prepared for planning was a fully comprehensive report, because somebody else is going to have to look through that report and decide whether the decision of approval or rejection is a good one. So it would presumably be almost exactly the same report that comes to the committee, because it's got to contain all the information in there, all the policies. So I'm not sure where is the much higher element of this. And what I find about our area planning committee is the most important thing is the people who are objecting, that they're given their opportunity to voice their concerns and objections to a planning application. It's a very emotional thing, as Councillor Mercer said. A planning application that is close to your property, that you feel will affect you, is a very emotional thing, and the kind of approval by the rest of the community that it goes ahead is very emotional. When people come to planning to voice their objections, it is controversial. It's the decision is going against me, and it's very deflating for people. But I think it is very worth that they come to the planning meeting, voice their concerns. Their concerns may contain one material point in it, and the rest of it is sometimes not material most of the time. But I think it's worth for them to feel that they have been heard. So I think reducing the number that get to committee, I don't think it's a great thing for democracy within our area. So I'm doubtful of it.
Thank you. Before Councillor Nixon, my pure concern is we have the additional planning committee or very expertise planning members in the future, and I have the reassurance, and perhaps Mr. Harbour can give that reassurance at the end when he sums up. They will be intensely trained, but I also believe that the same training needs to be extended to every single member, because we will be working with the parish and the town councils much, much closer, and we almost need to be little experts on the planning to decide at that point how we can best help them. And so our normal members, I think every councillor needs that extensive training, rather than just the handful of councillors, whether it's 11, whether it's 9 in each committee. Everybody needs the same training, because we will be working closely with the individual towns and town councils and parish councils to ensure that it is more streamlined. And I think everybody agrees here that it needs to be improved and more streamlined. But I must say I agree that it's got to be absolutely transparent as well, and whatever can be done to achieve that is very welcome. Councillor Maxwell.
I'd just like to bring up a situation which, an application which was heard 2 years ago, went to the inspector. The inspector somehow has dragged his heel. However, what's interesting is, at the time the application went in 2 years ago, one thing that was not considered was trees. Now, these trees, which are quite controversial, they're not the ones which were in the paper last week. They're a different set of trees. These trees were put in by the residents. The residents feel very, very strong about these trees. They don't want to see them disappear. There are about 500 of these residents, and when the inspector comes in May, I would say 500 would like to come along and listen to what the inspector's got to say. But the fact is that some applications which were heard some time ago are still only just coming through. And the fact that trees are maybe insignificant to some people are quite important to other people. So somehow the officers have somehow got to realise that the residents can't be shortchanged. They can't just be, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. It does matter. They've made a point, these residents, of standing up and doing something about them. What I'd like to see is, what are you going to do when, as it stands at the moment, the officers are not necessarily communicating with us fully, even from the parish and town councils? We don't really get a full answer about what's going to happen, and it worries me.
Thank you, Councillor Maxwell. I think the message is that probably that there need to be greater transparency of how the decisions, if delegated decisions are being taken, how are they taken? And if there's any regard to be given, and Councillor Maxwell told me before that if there's a property affected with trees or whatever, then regard needs to be given to that. But I think that is, that comes with the relationship between the officers and the residents as well. Councillor Jill Mercer.
Yeah, well, I think perhaps it would be really helpful if, when the officer is minded, if they're going to do a delegated application, that they inform, say, the ward members of their potential decision, because sometimes once it's decided, there's nothing you can do about it. So if they say they're going to refuse it and the ward member thinks that's wrong, or if they're going to grant it and the ward member doesn't agree, they've got an opportunity then to put in a representation and say, well, you know, I don't agree with that, perhaps it could go to committee. But it's that not knowing, we don't know until after the decision. I said earlier on about having a list, but actually that's sort of after the horse is bolted, you know. So really it would be ideal if we knew before the actual decision notice is created, but after the officers have decided, you know, which way they think it's got to go. Also, you have the situation if something hasn't come to committee, well, if it has come to committee, we've had an opportunity to input into it and perhaps strengthen the conditions. If we haven't had that opportunity, then if it goes to appeal, as it quite often does, the inspector won't, you know, seen what the councillors think about it. They'll just see one officer's decision. So I think we have to take that on board, because if we can take the controversial ones, if we take those into committee, that will certainly help. But it really needs more member input at various times.
Thank you. With regards to the quorum, I've just been reminded that in February 22, this committee actually took the decision to reduce it to 4. But we are at this report now. Councillor Andy Mercer. Sorry, it was Councillor Carter first, sorry.
Sorry, Andy. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with Dorothy, especially with the parish councils. We completely struggle. 21 days is not really long enough for us. We have our planning applications on the night of the meeting, and we struggle completely. At times we have mentioned this. Regarding as well, I know we're splitting the teams into 2, but are we trying to ram too many applications in one night? Because I know we're trying to save time and money, but are we? It's like we'll be there probably, I know if we get a lot of applications, we get some awkward ones, we could be there all night. So I think we need to really look at this closely, really. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Carter. Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you again, Madam Chairman. I suspect we're at risk of having what's nicknamed death spiral. That is, you reduce the size of something, it becomes less attractive to be involved in, so fewer people want to be on it. Then you find you can't staff the ones you've got, so you reduce it again, and you end up with a death spiral. And part of the reason for that is because some people find it a bit intimidating. I mentioned the example where we had to have police protection at the meeting. I didn't mention the fact that we had people come to our house to try and threaten us. When you've got a small number of councillors involved, they can do it. When you've got a larger number, it's not possible. And that's why I think the quorum for planning should be considered differently to the quorum for other committees, because in other committees, you don't have the likelihood of someone turning up at your house and threatening to do something violent to you. Well, I've never heard of it anyway. Whereas with planning, quite a few councillors have had similar experiences. And that's why I feel that we can have the quorum higher, particularly if we've got substitutes around. So we don't need to get, say you've got 11 on the committee. If you only get 3 of those people turn up, but you get 4 substitutes in, you've reached your quorum. And what's more, you've made it more difficult for someone to try and track down. Bear in mind, Madam Chairman, like you, my house, my address is on the website. officers, fortunately, are protected from that. They don't have that problem. It's a very unpleasant experience when you find someone turning up like that.
I hear what you're saying, Councillor Mercer, because it's happened to us, but not on planning, something totally different, and our address is not on the website, and the person still found us at home. So I do sympathise with you. Are there any other comments from anybody? Councillor Fedorowicz?
Just very quickly on the quorum. I mean, essentially, if we've already got a quorum of 4, you could consider, when I was thinking about the natural number with 9, I felt 6, but I know we obviously generally try to go for an odd number. But I mean, I would be happy with 7, but my natural head went to 6, so we could consider that if we're already on an even number.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell?
I just want to say one thing actually about the threatening behaviour. Now, I wasn't on the committee, but I've actually opposed quite a lot of applications or spoke for the residents. And not only have I threatened to have my legs chopped off, followed home, people sat outside my house, it's ongoing. It doesn't go away. The people the developers who want their applications to go through, they go to great means and to actually make sure you feel very uncomfortable. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Any other comments, or is that it? And then we've got Mr. Harbour. I wish you luck to summarise.
Thank you, Chair. I may be in danger, I think, of repeating myself as we go through this, because there are a number of overlapping points. But I should obviously try to make sure that I deal with as much as I can, and I'm sure if I miss something, members will say. So thank you very much for all the comments. I think there were a number of comments made by members around the time period that town and parish councils have to deal with planning applications. Because the first thing to say is that there's nothing within this proposal that changes the time period that town and parish councils have. We have always maintained a position whereby we would try to offer, wherever we can, flexibility when town and parish councils require it, a longer period to be able to make representations. The 21-day consultation period for town and parish councils is not a statutory time period. It's a statutory time period in terms of the minimum period of consultation, but to receive comments at a date later than the 21 days can often be accommodated for town and parish councils, and we do, because on occasion town and parish council representative will contact us and say we're struggling to get something back, and where we can we'll do that. I think it is important to remember that we sit here tonight as North Northamptonshire Council, the local planning authority, that's measured by government on a number of measures, but they also include our ability to make decisions within our statutory time periods. And of course, the longer that we start to extend out consultation periods, the less time there is for North Northamptonshire Council to do the work post-consultation, and the higher the risk is that actually we start to fail in terms of our ability to hit our statutory deadlines for decision making. And we shouldn't forget that. And of course, we report to corporate leadership team, we report to executive, and we report to government on our ability to hit those statutory time periods. And of course, there are authorities that are placed in special measures when they consistently fail to meet government targets on speed of determination, amongst other things. So I think there is a wider context there that we do need to just bear in mind, that as much as we extend a consultation period, we squash the back end of the planning process, and that puts at risk the council's ability to as I say, meet those statutory deadlines. I do think it's a fair point that actually if we're going to make amendments to the scheme of delegation which would require for non-major applications a town or parish councillor who might seek to have something called in and need the ability to liaise with a ward member after they've considered the application, that actually if they're trying to do that within the 21 days that's currently within the proposal for ward member call-in, that might make things difficult. And I think perhaps there is scope for us to consider perhaps extending the 21-day ward member call-in period perhaps to something like 24 days, which would give slightly longer for town or parish councils to consider applications, to liaise with a ward councillor around call-in, whilst not squashing the back end of the process up too much. So I think that's something which perhaps members might want to consider. And I think that would be perhaps a reasonable compromise position. I do think that town and parish councils also need to offer some flexibility about how they operate as well, because of course, as I say, it is North Northamptonshire Council that's actually under the statutory deadline, not town and parish councils, but we are the ones measured by government. There were obviously a lot of comments about transparency. The process is transparent. All planning information is available on the council's website, and so everything relating to planning application is available for the public to view. Where delegated decisions are made, the decision and the officer report that supports the decision-making process is on the website. Anyone can view that, and that explains why the decision was made and what was taken into account in that decision. So I think in terms of transparency, I believe the system is transparent. It's there for everybody to see and interrogate. And in terms of the ability of the public to engage within the planning process, well, that exists. And the proposals here offer nothing to amend what exists. So members of the public can make a representation on any planning application that they wish to. And actually, I don't agree that the trigger points are too low. I think a trigger of 5, if something is truly controversial, is not particularly high. I think, you know, I live on a cul-de-sac, and if there was something truly controversial in a cul-de-sac, I'm pretty sure that amongst my neighbours we'd be able to put together 5 signatures. So I think what we do have to bear in mind here is that what these proposals are trying to achieve is a more efficient and effective committee system that operates in a way that is, I suppose, reflective of the unitary authority that we now are. And I think, as well as the public being able to make direct objections to planning applications, which they've always had the ability to, there's no proposal to amend that. They also have the ability to speak to town and parish councils. They have the ability to speak to their ward councillor directly as well. They have the ability to try and engage with the planning service too through those representations. So I think there's certainly access and an ability for the public. I've noted it down here. One of the comments was that the public don't get the opportunity to make their feelings known when decisions are delegated, but they do. You know, that's the whole point of public consultation. That 21-day public consultation period is exactly for that purpose. What else have we got down here? I think there were some comments again around the fact that public aren't specifically mentioned this report. They're not, because this report is really focusing in on the proposals of PAS, but also the recommendations of the Planning Transformation Board, which don't include anything which materially affect the direct involvement of the public. And that's why this report doesn't focus so much on the public as it does on, for example, Town and Parish Council trigger, which was highlighted by PAS, and where the data suggests that actually that is the one thing which triggers more applications going to committee than any other. I believe that the PAS recommendation that committee's time and capacity should be focused on most significant applications is correct. A controversial application is a significant application, but it can be. And there are other measures within the scheme of delegation which enable controversial applications to be brought to committee. So there are effectively at least three triggers within the proposed scheme of delegation that would enable a controversial application to be triggered to come to committee. One is the ward member call-in. And actually, if an application is truly controversial, one would expect that the ward member would be tuned into that and would be able to call the application in. There is the objections from members of the public. And again, if an application was truly controversial, then one would think that members of the public objections would trigger that coming to committee. There is the senior officer ability to bring the application to committee if they believe it's contentious, and as part of contentious, I would believe controversy may well be a part of the contention. I know there was a suggestion there that it shouldn't be the senior officer that does that. Ward councillors already have the ability to do that, and they are the local eyes and ears of the council on the ground. But of course, it's the planning officers that have the ability to see more holistically what is coming back through a consultation process, because not only do they have that ability for a dialogue with ward members, they also see the statutory consultee responses coming in. They also see the responses coming in from members of the public through the public consultation period. So actually they do have a relatively good picture of whether an application is looking as though it might be controversial or not. And finally, if an application is a major application, then the town or parish council has that direct opportunity to trigger an application coming to committee. So I believe the scheme of delegation actually includes multiple measures by which controversial applications can be brought to committee.
Madam Chairman, can we stop at that point, because I disagree fundamentally about what's been said so far, and this is a member debate after all. We say we're being told that controversial applications get to committee. Well, let's deal with examples. Let's be specifics. Shirley Road in Rushton, 600 objections to it in the first pass, 200 more when the appeal was registered, people already demonstrating in the streets, We've had people blocking roads, and yet this did not come to committee. You don't get much more controversial than that. They were proposing to take down an entire avenue of streets, just like Wellingborough. It's intensely controversial locally, yet it did not come to committee. I therefore am absolutely convinced, I'm afraid, that the arguments used by the officer are incorrect. The changes that I proposed for the scheme of delegation are necessary because it hasn't worked so far, and we have now got a major problem where we have got a planning application where we are in deep trouble.
Okay. Thank you. Would you like to carry on, Mr.
Yeah, and I'm happy to come back on that. And I don't, I don't want to get into the specifics of individual applications, but that's one application out of the 4,000 applications we deal with every year. And I think when you're dealing with the quantity of applications that we do deal with, there will always be an opportunity to highlight some occasions that don't go to plan. Because I don't think any system, and I don't believe that there'll probably be any scheme of delegation for any local planning authority in the country where some applications slip through the net or don't occur in the way that that members would like. The reason I believe that application didn't come to committee was because the decision accorded with the high number of objections. So it wasn't as though the application was approved against 600 objections. It was refused in line with the representations. But we're in danger here of getting into a dissection of an individual application. I don't think that's entirely what this is.
Councillor Mercer, could you please let Mr. Harbour speak? I don't think it is helpful. We need to come back to actually our report. I know if there are several members who feel very aggrieved with an application if it slips through the net, so to speak, it's been called in and the outcome was not what was expected. But Mr. Harbour is not here to justify that. And please, if we can keep the respect for our officers when we are talking to them. Thank you. Mr. Harbour.
So, thank you, Chair. As I say, there are, I think, 3 to 4 triggers within the scheme of delegation that would enable those kind of applications to come to committee, and indeed, a ward member calling could have brought that application to committee as well. I think I'm not going to comment on the issue around number of committee members and quorum, because I think that's more a matter for colleagues in Democratic Services to advise on, and indeed the proposals on those numbers were put into the terms of reference in consultation with colleagues in Democratic Services. I don't have any particularly strong feelings either way. What I'm most interested in is that we're able to make sound decisions, that we're able to defend at appeal when that situation arises. There was some discussion around decisions, and I think visibility of decisions is important. I think that's probably is something that we can do something about, and I'm quite happy to take that away. I don't think it actually, it doesn't influence this proposal. I think it's a separate matter. But I think what we could potentially do is to try to start generating weekly lists of decisions that go out with the weekly list of planning applications. Of course, all decisions are available, as I said, on the website anyway, but I understand the fact that that's a lot of work for members to spend looking back through the website to find those. So I'm sure that we'll be able to produce something that could accommodate that. There was a comment made around the rotation of locations of committees. That was something which was discussed at Planning Transformation Board. At the board meeting, it was felt by members that it was important that there was a committee venue within each of the locations, the geographic locations. I mean, I think, again, from an officer perspective, I don't have any hard and fast views about that. That was they were the views of the Planning Transformation Board. I do think that one of the things that perhaps we could explore, and certainly, for example, this is a venue with better technology, gives us an opportunity for members to be able to join virtually, to save them having to travel to meetings. And actually that might encourage a higher...
That's not lawful.
You can't. Correct.
Just for clarity.
Yes.
Sorry, just for a matter of correction, obviously the members who are formally constituting these committees have to appear on site. There is obviously the possibility for ward members or even objectors or applicants potentially to come in via hybrid meeting, but just to be clear, the actual members making the decisions and voting have to be on site and present in the meeting themselves. Sorry, just for clarity.
Thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So, Chair, if I can continue. So I wasn't proposing, obviously, that committee wasn't in the chamber, simply that members of the public could join virtually, and that actually that might be a system which actually helps to encourage higher public engagement in the planning process. So that might be something for members to consider. There were some comments about too many applications coming to committee. Again, I think if you look at the planning data, what you'll see there is that actually, if we continued to consider the same number of applications that we do at the moment, at 2 planning committees per month, that's less than 5 applications per committee. That isn't a high committee workload. And I would point you also to the benchmarking information for unitaries. 6 of the 7 authorities that we looked at operate a single planning committee for their area. So I think 2 is perfectly reasonable, and the workload for that committee I think would be more than manageable. Member training was mentioned, and I do think that's important. Obviously, we do carry out member training at the moment. There was some, I think, which took place last week, was the most recent. Of course, there will be a need to roll out further training if we move to a 2-committee system. One of the things which was considered by members at Planning Transformation and Constitutional Working Group is the issue around minerals and waste applications, and obviously for many members that will be something new to them. But of course, that was the same to a number of members of the Strategic Planning Committee that also deal with minerals and waste applications. So I think we were able to provide training for members of the Strategic Planning Committee. That's something we can roll out, much wider to other members that might serve on committees dealing with those applications. So, I agree. I think the member training is important, but I think that's something which can be accommodated. I think, other than there were some comments made around ward councillor involvement in delegated decisions. I think that creates an enormous complication. A delegated officer decision is generally that, and I think that's a decision which is made by the officer on their professional judgment. Comment was made earlier on also about our successor appeal, and I think as much as as we can use data to try to demonstrate the quality of decision making. What that shows us is that by and large, and again, it's not always going to be the case for every application, but by and large, the quality of decision making is generally good. Certainly, I think, if I understood the proposal correctly, that at the point prior to a delegated decision being issued, it was communicated to the ward councillor to enable them to trigger a call-in would create a significant amount more work, and it would most definitely have a detrimental impact on the performance of the planning service. I think I've probably covered most things that I had listed, Chair.
Thank you. I think so too. Could you just roll back? You said the time period. It was always maintained the position of flexibility, and you said there's scope to consider the request to come into committee to 24 days, if I heard you right. But please remind me of the statutory deadline for applications. Is it 28 days?
No, so it's for non-major applications, Chair, it's 8 weeks.
8 weeks.
But of course, you do have to bear in mind that within that 8 weeks, it's very unlikely that a committee which sits once every month falls on week 8. And of course, reports have to be published in advance of that. So actually, when you start working backwards to first available committee within the 8-week period, then take off a week for the report to be ready and published in advance of that, actually you start eating into that 8 weeks quite considerably to take something to committee. And that's that period that I'm talking about in terms of the longer you extend consultation, the more you squash that end period if something's coming to committee. So that's just the thing we need to, I think, be a little bit cautious of.
I'm aware that there is some flexibility from planning officers if an application can only be commented on by a parish council, for instance, a few days later. But I'd rather have that in this document so it is clear to everybody that there may be some flexibility, and but the 24th, so we could move up a little bit to enable, the members, the ward councillor and so on, to work with the parish councils or town councils to really sort of get some good relationship and really get all the points if there are strong objections and applications that are controversial, which brings me in. You mentioned 4 triggers. If it's to become a controversial or significant application, can you remind me of the 4 triggers, please?
Yes, of course, Chair. So, so one of them obviously will be objectors from members of the public. Yeah. So obviously, if something's highly controversial, you would expect that would probably elicit a number of objections through the public consultation period, and it quite often does. There is the ward member call-in facility. There is the ability of the senior planning officer to identify that it's controversial and decide that it should be referred to committee for the decision. Finally, obviously, where it's a major application, there's also the town and parish council ability to directly trigger something coming into to committee.
So we've got 5. This is brilliant. It's good to improve on that. I've just sort of, you said the trigger of 5, and you gave the example if you had your neighbours or somebody and they could object. I think some of us are aware of an application that is extremely controversial, but effectively only has 2 objectors, plus perhaps a parish council and the ward councillor, which wouldn't reach that figure, because although there may be 12, 14 people living on one address, they wouldn't be counted because it would be counted as one objection. And the second, that's what has happened in the past. And possibly, say, the next door neighbour who's also affected by it, there would be 2 objections. Then you would have, because there's the same address, then you would have, say, the parish council not wanting that, the ward councillor. If you have both ward councillors or 3 ward councillors, will they count individually, or will they be consolidated into one objection?
Thank you, Chair. So I think the issue here around multiple objections from a single household is simply that actually the impact of the proposal is actually quite limited. It's limited to one house. So it there may be a lot of people within it, but it's not a widespread.
It is. Sorry to...
Sorry, I've misunderstood, because yes. I thought you said that...
I have got one application that is being worked on at the moment, which is undecided. It is 1 address, and it's got about 12 plus people living in separate entities on that address site. I can't specify any other way at the moment.
Right. Okay. Well, I think if they're living as separate entities,
they've
then
got the same address.
Well, presumably, yeah. In any event, it's relatively simple, because you mentioned that there were 1 or 2 ward councillors involved, and therefore the ward councillor can just call it in. So the ward councillor doesn't need to count as one of the 5 objectors. It just needs a single ward councillor who thinks it's controversial, has a material planning reason to call it to committee.
Thank you. The first one was Councillor Jill Mercer and then Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you. Thank you for coming back about the suggestion of coming back to ward councillors. There is already a mechanism, though, where when, say, a town or parish council object to something, and it comes then to the chair and vice chair to see whether to call it into committee. So if that still happens, I mean, because the town and parish council will only come in as a major if this goes through, surely that could still be, that you could still run it past chair and vice chair. Do you think this warrants coming to committee? So it wouldn't be any different. I mean, whether it goes to the chair and vice chair or the ward member, is still a process that happens at the moment. So I just wondered if that could be considered. You mentioned about the website, just made me think that, one application I was looking at yesterday had 652 comments on it. It's rather difficult to trawl through all those. It's very difficult. The website's not easy to use. So it may be transparent, but only if you've got about 2 weeks to trawl through everything and you've got the patience to do that. So the other thing was this significant. I think the word significant is very subjective. Thank you. That's the word I wanted. If you're relying on the officer who perhaps doesn't know all the local, intricacies, that if it was in conjunction with, say, chair and vice chair, I think that would be better, because at least then they could give a pointer to it.
Thank you. Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is all opinion. I just happen to disagree with the officer on several of these matters. I disagree quite strongly. I think that we must explicitly refer to controversial planning applications, not just significant ones. I proposed earlier on, or I suggested several amendments, 2 amendments to the scheme of delegation, and I still believe that they are necessary, because otherwise it requires individuals in various places to get things right. And good systems are ones that work when you have people getting things wrong. I noticed several other councillors spoke about the issue of contentious or controversial applications. There was not a single councillor who thought that my suggestion was inappropriate. I would therefore like to propose that we amend the appendix to this report to include those changes, because if I'm correct, it will improve things. At worst, it will merely mean that one or two extra applications will go to committee, ones that should have gone to committee in the first place, I believe. So I thereby propose, Madam Chairman.
Right. Can you please take us back to the exact area where you wanted that amendment in, please?
Okay, Madam Chairman. The first one was the on page 25, the first block, where it said...
Is it a not...
subsection IV4.
Yeah.
It said applications that the relevant senior planning officer considers are potentially contentious or raise material planning condition issues. I propose that should be the chair or vice chair considers are potentially contentious, because they have the local knowledge. And secondly, the very last paragraph in the scheme delegation, where it says the request shall be considered by the chair or vice chair of the relevant planning committee in consultation with the senior planning officer upon agreement that the referral contains material planning issue that the application shall be called in. I feel that should be reworded to say the request shall be considered by the chair or vice chair of the relevant planning committee, and if they consider that the application is controversial or has material planning issues, then it shall be called in. It's slightly different wording from what I said before, because I can't remember the exact wording, but that's, I'm sure that the legal officers are experts on this, can tighten it up. It will have the effect that we will hopefully bring in some of the controversial ones that have caused us trouble, even if the members might want to refuse it and the officers also want to refuse it. What it will do is allow members of the public a chance to let off steam, and it also might mean that some of the reasons for refusal can be tightened up. Now, I know that may sound ambitious, but that has happened in the past. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Could I have a legal view on that, please? Would it be appropriate?
I think that Councillor Mercer was just asking me to tighten up the words afterwards, which I can do. In terms of the actual content of it, I don't really know how to comment on it. It's for members.
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder if the Rob might have some comments on it, because he's the professional officer for planning.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I'm struggling to see why removing the ability of a senior planning officer to bring an application, a controversial application, to committee would not be a good thing. If we were trying to have a fail-safe system, then surely having more people that effectively have more knowledge of what's going on with an application, having an ability to identify it's controversial and refer it to committee, would be more of a fail-safe than to exclude them from having that ability.
Councillor Mercer?
Madam Chairman, I'm quite happy for the senior planning officer to also have that ability, but it should not be solely with the senior planning officer.
We must be mindful that the planning officer is the expert at the end of the day. And if I can finish, please. They are the expert, and they have to put forward what they believe is best in accordance with planning regulations and the law. And we may know an awful lot, but we are not the expert at any time.
Councillors are not professionals in planning, but they are the experts on the local situation.
I fully agree with that. And if you look at it, the request shall be considered by the chair or vice chair of the relevant planning committee in consultation with the senior planning officer, and upon agreement that the referral contains a material planning issue, the application shall be called in. I don't see much wrong with it.
Simple. Upon agreement. In other words, the senior planning officer has a veto over it.
I'm sure if
And what's more, this only allows it on if there is material planning issues. It does not include the contentious ones, as I've pointed out.
perhaps we can add those words, contains a material planning issue, is what were the words you used, controversial or significant. Can we add those words?
We want significant and controversial, but we also do not want planning officers to have a veto over it, which that wording does.
But at the end of the day, the officers will be the ones, if we lose and it goes to appeal, and the appeal is heard, the planning officers will have all the information, all the regulations and law, and have to defend it. It's not us who defend it.
On the most significant one I've been involved in, I defended it, not the officers, and I won.
That may be so, but not at NNC.
It was at ENC, it was Birch's Garage.
Yeah, we need to move forward with it as well. Perhaps if I ask the committee what you would feel if we put in the wording, and this is on page 27, isn't it? We are just on the right one, Mr. Harbour.
Chair, I think if it helps, so I haven't, unfortunately, I'm looking at an appendix which isn't paginated, but I believe what I'm looking at is effectively the final trigger point on the scheme. Yeah, the ward. So this is the ward member calling. I don't have an issue with the removal of upon agreement. The key thing for me is the involvement of the senior planning officer working in consultation with the chair and vice chair to provide their professional opinion to them.
Okay.
If the chair and vice chair wish to ignore professional opinion, that's their choice to make. But I think for me the key thing is that advice is there, that professional advice is there for the chair and vice chair.
Thank you. Would that meet then your requirements or your view if we just take out the three words, consultation with the senior planning officer, delete and upon agreement, that the referral contains a material planning issue, that the application should be called in. A material planning issue is containing everything, Councillor Mercer. Councillor Watt.
We'll let Councillor Watt go first.
We're only discussing the call-in here. We're not actually discussing the consideration of the application. The consideration of the application would be fully considered from the information supplied by the planning officers, and the committee would reach a decision. We're not prejudging the decision here. It's just actually getting to committee.
Councillor Jill Mercer.
Yeah, when the discussion was going on earlier on, it was about the top point, not that bottom one, and that's where Councillor Mercer suggested having chair and vice chair, and the officer said that the senior planning officer ought to also be able to. So could we not just add in the relevant chair and vice chair plus the senior planning officer, so we have both having the opportunity, or they both have the opportunity, so that the officer thinks it's, then obviously that's very reasonable, but then you've got the member input as well. So that covers both options.
Madam Chairman, I would be happy with that version.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell.
Well, I would like to say that I might be wrong here. The senior officer can make a decision whether it's brought in. Now, I actually don't agree with that, because I think it shouldn't be just the senior officer can bring it in to make the decision whether or not, because it means you leave out the ward councillor and the parishes whether this should be brought in, because the whole idea of planning is that the residents have a say on an application which is in their area. It should be their consideration. It shouldn't be put on them that the officers would make that decision, because otherwise they'll just think they don't have a say.
I think, sorry, Mr. Harbour.
Chair, I think just for clarity here, this is what we're seeking to do is to ensure that we provide a safety net so that amongst the intelligence of Chair, Vice Chair, Senior Planning Officer, ward members, that there is enough, I suppose, intelligence around local feeling, the details of the application to bring something to committee. Once it's at committee, that's the point at which the public have that opportunity to attend, the right to speak, etc., etc. So I think the involvement of this is precisely what it's doing, is to safeguard the ability of the public to be involved.
Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think we've got a compromise that everyone's comfortable with for the first item. I'm trying to find a compromise for the one at the end now.
Right.
If we said the request shall be considered by the Chair or Vice Chair of the relevant Planning Committee with the advice of the Senior Planning Officer, that the referral contains material planning issue or is sufficiently controversial, then the application shall be called in. I think that might meet the desire. No? Mr. Harbour's still unhappy. Can you explain why?
Sorry.
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, through you. I think if we changed it to and, no, it doesn't necessarily need to be controversial. The issue is that I believe what we should be doing is safeguarding the committee from placing them in a position where they're being asked to determine an application which might be controversial, but the reasons for the controversiality are not material, because the soundness of the decision is only when it's judged on material planning reasons. And one of the things which is quite important that we don't do is effectively determine planning applications as a popularity contest. We know that planning applications quite often involve difficult decisions, and oftentimes that can mean that somebody is unhappy with that decision, whether it be an approval or a refusal. But it has to be. But those decisions, in order to safeguard the process, have to be material. So my concern with saying or controversial is that it unless I've misunderstood, it opens the door for committee to consider a controversial application for reasons that aren't material.
Yeah. Mr. Gold wanted to come in.
Well, just coming in on the back of what my colleague said and putting the old hat on, I'd like a clear definition of what controversial is.
Yes.
Because because if we make decisions based on the concept of something being controversial and things going down a certain way, we could be asked to justify that decision. And I don't know how I haven't heard anybody clearly define yet what controversial is that would stand up to objective scrutiny. Chair.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right. And perhaps we can have that explanation. And I'm sort of like that with the proposals you've made, and you wanted to come back.
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is that we risk predetermining the application. We are deciding whether or not we're going to allow it to go to committee on whether or not someone has made an assessment that there are material planning conditions or issues. That is an opinion. It may not be accurate. It should be tested in the open. We are predetermining them by saying that some officer has decided that there aren't any material planning issues here, therefore it won't go to committee. That is a very, very dangerous path to go down. Right, the second point is that whether it's controversial or not does not affect the committee's decision-making process. That merely determines whether or not the committee should be the person to look at it or whether it should be an officer in his office. And that, once again, is something that is undesirable. The more controversial something is, the more public the discussion about it should be. The controversy should not affect the outcome, but it should affect how it is presented to the public. And that is the thing that concerns us, that there is an impression that decisions are made behind closed doors and the public isn't given their chance to say.
Thank you. Councillor Watt.
I agree with Councillor Mercer's comments. It's important that the public, if it's a controversial application, it's important that the public do have their say. They may be ranting and raving about something that is perhaps not material, but I think it's important for our democracy that we let them have their say. And then the committee would decide on the material planning considerations. And if there is nothing raised by the objectors that could prevent or reject the application, then it would go through. This denial of controversial applications just because they're inconvenient for the planning department, I think is a dangerous one for our democracy.
Yes.
Sorry, Chair, just to make it quite clear, I was asking for a definition of controversial. Yes. It's nothing to, it's no reflection on officers' judgment. It is, members around this table in debate have used the term controversial. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask for an objective definition of what is classified as controversial.
Absolutely.
I totally agree with you, Paul. I wasn't disputing what you were saying. I agree with you. It's subjective what is controversial, and it's probably numbers that is a definition.
Thank you, Mr. Harbour.
And I just want to make the point that actually what I'm trying to achieve here is a sound and robust planning system, whoever's making the decision. So it's not about whether it's inconvenient to planning officers or not. It's about trying to ensure that we put in place the correct system. My concern is that triggering applications to come to committee for non-material planning reasons places the committee in a difficult position where actually they may have many members of the public who may have very strong feelings about a particular application, and committee, if they are to make that decision on material planning reasons, are faced with effectively having to do that in the face of a lot of local opposition. Now, I'm not suggesting that can't or shouldn't happen, but I suppose I'm just suggesting that it places the committee in a difficult position. If that's if that's the position members want to be in, then that is a choice for them to make. But that's my advice: is that we shouldn't be seeking to refer things to committee unless it's on material reasons.
Thank you. I'm looking for an olive branch now, and I make a suggestion. The request shall be considered by the chair or vice chair of the relevant planning committee with or upon advice of the senior planning officer that the referral contains a material planning issue. The application shall be called in, and somewhere in here to have a proper explanation what a controversial, what the word controversial really means in former planning applications, with a few very, very small examples for the public also to understand, because the public will see this as well, the parish council is not that up to speed at all times with planning regulations. Mr. Harbour.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I'm comfortable with what you've suggested. I think the other thing probably to point out is given the other amendment that we discussed tonight, which effectively enables the Chair and Vice Chair already to determine something is referred to committee on the grounds of it being controversial, I think we're effectively kind of doubling up. If a ward councillor calls something in, it's considered by the Chair and Vice Chair. The Chair and Vice Chair already have the ability to call something in based upon the amendment we've considered. So I personally, I think it's covered.
Yeah, I hear what you are saying, but please bear in mind that not everybody is an expert on the planning definitions, and I heard earlier on, I think members are minded that we have a full explanation of controversial somewhere in there. I also would like to see, if we turn back to page 27, in the middle, the request shall be received by the relevant senior planning officer not within 21 days. And I'm actually looking if we can achieve 25 as a minimum. And to allow parish and town councils is just one more than you said, but I think it is very important because that would give 5 weeks. That will fall in between, hopefully, where parish councils meet, to enable them to take a democratic decision in the parish councils as well. It's been the major complaint from parish councils that they are not being included in any decisions. Councillor Jill Mercer.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned much about the 2 committees. I just wanted to check what the officer's opinion is, because we are under a boundary review at the moment. These ward boundaries are likely to change. So will that be revised in that respect when that happens?
Mr. Harbour.
Chair, through you, shall I I'll deal with both things, shall I?
Yep.
First, the 25 days. So just to be certain, so this is the time period for the ward member call-in that we're discussing here. I think we could. I think the system can accommodate 25 days. Yeah. I think that probably is as far as we can realistically push it, though. That I think we've hit the boundary there, but that's that. In terms of ward boundary changes, yes, very, very aware that those may change at some point in the future, and I think we would just have to redraw where the line is to accommodate ward boundaries. I think it is quite important that we use ward boundaries as the dividing line, because when applications are put onto the system, they're allocated by ward, and I think it's simpler if a ward member and people that live within a certain area are just clear that all applications within that ward go to one committee, rather than some might go one way, some might go another, and that just adds to the chance of confusion.
That's brilliant. That leaves me just the last paragraph. And I'm proposing the request shall be considered by the Chair or Vice Chair of the relevant planning committee, and with the advice of the Senior Planning Officer that the referral contains a material issue, the application shall be called in. It covers everything. Would I find the support of the committee to put that forward as an amendment? That looks as though the majority. Yes, Councillor Mercer.
I'm happy. Well, I'm content with that as a compromise. But can I suggest that, given we've got a boundary review that's going to hit us later, which is going to require changes to the boundary between north and south, that at the time when that is brought back to this committee to recommend new boundaries, because that's what will happen, can we assess how successful this scheme of delegation is at the same time?
I think you will probably find that even before the 2 years where boundary changes are taking place, that other amendments will be made to this document. I believe it is more or less a living document, which, if full council agrees with it, will be there for time, but only time will tell whether we've got it right. And we need to ensure that our planning system is really slick, that it's efficient and effective, and has the public involved as well.
Well, okay,
Councillor
then.
Mercer, you wanted to speak.
I was just going to say I'm happy with, I'm content with the compromise, and we look at it again, as you said, as a living document sometime in the future, not 2 years out, because that's too far, but 8, 9 months or a year, something like that.
That's fine, and I would also like to have added the explanation what controversial means in sort of just a couple of examples. A substantial, a controversial, what was the other one? The other explanations you gave, significant, and so on. What? Yes.
Yeah, Chair. So I think, I mean, obviously we'll probably have to take that away and work that up.
Yes.
But what I would suggest is members will note in Appendix A, we already include a footnote at the bottom to define major applications. So I think we could, we can potentially just add some more footnotes to define that.
So with those, Councillor Maxwell.
Right, I just want to make a suggestion, is that maybe in order to help, I'm talking about small parish councils now, who tend to rock up with the actual application on the night of the meeting, their council meeting, that they email out to each councillor on that council the application, because what tends to happen is they rock up on the night with the application, which hasn't given the rest of the committee time to have a look at it. So a suggestion is that officers make sure that the applications are sent around to the parishes, and the parishes give everybody a chance to read it.
They do receive the weekly list, but I'm sure if there's any improvement possible, I don't expect a daily one or anything, but I think it's got to be ensured that the parishes and towns are included. If you want to add something.
Not on that point. All I was going to say was I think that we need to look at this term controversial and the subjectivity of that. So that's some work that we need to do after that to make sure that it is objective. I wonder, Chair, if it would be useful for you to have delegated authority to do some of these amendments afterwards so that we can get that wording right, and we can work between the lawyers and we can work between Rob as well to make sure that we get the right wording in place.
Would that find support from the committee if the Chair and Vice Chair have that flexibility? Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, by support.
Yes, I'll just point out that point 4 on page 25 already says potentially contentious. So I think, we've already got that word in there. So
we've got that. Yeah. There's one more amendment or two amendments on page 31. As I said, 11 is a very ambitious figure, because the next bit we have a scrutiny, and there are extra scrutiny committees. So the workload you all will have, and the rest of our members, is going to increase no end. So if we leave it at 11, well, I wish our deputy leader good luck to finding all those people, but I don't believe it is achievable. I would like to see it to be reduced to 9. But it's entirely up to you. If you want 11, and if it can be filled, great. If it can't, we can't. So, Councillor Mercer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I will live with 11, but I'd have preferred 13.
That is
As I said, I came from a council where we had 18.
It's unachievable, Councillor Mercer. Councillor Jill Mercer.
I'd just like to remind people that was discussed earlier on, it's going down from, 30 or 40 something. Paul, you said that some are dual hatters, but, there's certainly in around about 40 members of planning committees at the moment, so it would halving that number. So I really don't think 11 is unachievable.
Okay, so
And-
you
and-
believe that it should
So
be...
while we're talking that, are we going to decide on the quorum as well?
Sorry, say again.
The quorum. We need
The,
to,
the
yeah.
quorum as well. Can we first deal with the each committee? You said you felt it should be...
I'd be more comfortable with 13, to be honest.
Is there any other view from anybody else, Councillor Nichols?
Yeah. So I support the suggested 9. The reason is because looking into the future, you do have to consider the amount of councillors that are going to be lost, and how we're going to find members to fill those vacancies in that committee. Which is why I would feel comfortable supporting a 9 membership with a quorum potentially around 7, because I would rather have a committee made up of a low amount of members who will attend the meetings as opposed to having 11 members and having to quorum for substitutes every single month. So I think 9 is much more manageable.
Of course, there's also the possibility we could or amend it to 12, and then you've got 3 from each side.
Equal. We don't have equal.
Hmm?
We don't tend to have equal membership.
No?
We do odd numbers.
Not at all,
Not usually.
because the chair still got 2 votes.
Yeah, we don't. No, we don't.
It was just a thought that if we had more, then I can see you had more representation from members, but it's entirely up to
Sorry,
you.
I was mumbling to the chair, but I realised no one else could hear me. We tend to have odd numbers with our committees because of the votes. That's why. So apologies.
Okay. So, Councillor Fedorovich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I actually agree with Councillor Nicholl on this. I think having a smaller but more concentrated group that are committed to coming to committee, and then if you do have to have those subs, that importance is really laid on. So yeah, I do think if we have, make sure that we do have people coming to committee committed, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, we're flexible, and you don't know, or none of us know, what will happen at full council, whether full council all members will agree with this proposal. So, can I have some guidance? You wanted 13, and could I have a show of hands if anybody wants 13 members on the committee? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Which we can't have. I've just been told. We can't have 12, so we had 4. Yeah. Yeah. So, who's for 13? 1, 2, 3, 4. 11? 1? 9?
Can I just say I'm for both? I'm happy for the
You're both, yeah. And 9, 2. 13 have it. So let's increase it to 13, and time will tell whether we can fill it or not. I don't think it's right, but it goes into full council, so the decision will be taken at full council anyway, whether that is the right figure. Councillor Watt.
Will we be looking for like a spread of councillors across the North Ants Area Committee and the South North Ants Area Committee, because we've got 17 wards in the north and 11 wards in the south. So it would appear that it would be easier to fulfil it in the north because we've got 17 wards.
Yep.
I don't know if we're going to lose 3 wards from the north because it's about that much, isn't it? But are we going to have a spread of councillors? Because we could have a concentration of councillors from one kind of area, one maybe the east north Ants side of.
We don't sort of play one against the other. We are one council, and I hear what you're saying, because the old East North Ants area has got a lot more villagers, and that combined with Kettering and Corby will be quite a heavy workload. But time will tell. If it doesn't work in 3 months' time or so, we can review it, and I'm sure that Mr. Harbour will be the first one to tell us that it doesn't work. And Mr. Gold wanted to come in.
Yeah, the committees will be treated as any other committee and they'll be based on political balance. How the groups wish to choose their membership of the committees is entirely up to the committees, as it is now, where they could put people on Corby Planning Committee from one particular, you know, the north of Corby, and nobody in Danesholm or whatever is there. So it is based on political balance, and it's a matter for the groups. If they've got 9 seats, 11 seats, 13 seats, you know, it'll be split that way.
Yeah. Councillor Mercer.
We're assuming, I hope, that it will be the political balance for the area concerned. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. With that, with also, oh, sorry, there's a quorum, and I think we are increasing. Then the 7 voting members should be right, as proposed by Councillor Andy Mercer. With that, can I have your agreement with those amendments, and obviously any amendments, minor amendments, that our legal officer comes up with, that I and the Vice Chairman have the authority to agree to those. So the recommendations, if you turn to page 2, are you able to support them with the amendments we've discussed? And if so, then I'd like to see a show of hands.
I'd like to second that motion.
Thank you. And can I have a show of hands for? Anybody against? Councillor Watt abstaining? Okay. That is carried. And with that, that item is closed. So if members would like a quick 5-minute break, a comfort break, I think now's the time. I don't know whether those members who came to observe, whether you want to stay for the scrutiny decision as well, which is fine. But I will, after we come back, I will ask you to suspend standing orders and have the time added on. Councillor Tai.
Madam Chairman, fellow councillors, officers, for personal reasons, I have to be in Rushden by 10:30, and it would take, I would think, a minimum of an hour this time of night to go through Corby and get home. Yeah. So.
Do you want to leave, Councillor Tai?
Attend for the second item on the agenda.
Yeah. I don't think we will be finished by 10 o'clock with the second item. I do not believe so.
I mean, if it's going to...
I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
If it's going to be delayed, that's fine.
What do you think?
I'm going to go.
all, I need your agreement that we suspend standing orders. Is there a seconder for that? I second. Thank you. Are you all in favour to suspend standing orders to finish this item? But maximum an hour, no more than that. Or is it, what is our strategy? It's 30 minutes, isn't it? Yeah, 30 minutes and no more. If after 30 minutes we do not come to a conclusion, then I propose that it is agreed as is and goes to full council. Have I got your agreement for that? Thank you very much. Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm hoping this won't be as controversial, that word again. I won't define it. Okay, so this is the scrutiny review. Members have already looked at this before, so hopefully, you know, this should be a little smoother. So in terms of where we're at, so proposals were brought a few months ago in relation to changing the scrutiny structure for North Northamptonshire, and there was a presentation brought to this committee. Following on from that, the committee agreed that we would go out for a period of consultation to ask members about their views, go out and ask officers as well what they felt about scrutiny and the proposals around it. And also we went to the Centre for Public Scrutiny that is attached to this report. So the idea is that we would change from having 2 scrutiny committees to 3 scrutiny committees. That's our place and economy, our health scrutiny and our corporate committee. And then we would have a scrutiny management board overarching that to help with the strategic direction of it. That was following feedback from officers and members even prior to this review about how scrutiny was working at North Northamptonshire. So thinking about feedback, as the report sets out, so looking at the Scrutiny Management Board, this also went to Constitutional Review Working Group. The main changes to this were that the Constitutional Review Working Group felt that the call-in should go straight to the Scrutiny Management Board as the overarching board, which would generally have the chairs and vice chairs on it, and call-ins would go there and they would be the overarching body. That corresponds with the Centre for Public Scrutiny's views that it's better if it goes into one board rather than being moved to different boards all the time or the committees. So that's the main proposals with that one. In terms of the health, the main changes around that were in terms of crime and disorder. So one of the comments from the Centre for Public Scrutiny was that it may be a better fit for that to go into the Place and Environment Committee as well. I think when looking at that, there's 2 different ways of looking at it. So crime and disorder has a huge impact on health, and we know that that's an outcome of poor crime and disorder. But actually, lots of crime and disorder is a place function in terms of, you know, it's something around the place. So you could look at it in 2 different ways, and I could see how it could fit into either. Following on from Constitutional Review Working Group, we moved that into the Place and Environment Committee, but it may be that members want to move it back, and I think that that's you know, fine either way. In terms of place and environment, there wasn't actually any changes to that other than the crime and disorder coming into it. In terms of the corporate committee, I think all members were really keen on a corporate committee, but I heard members' views on whether we should have a separate budget committee, you know, to really focus on that. So looking at Centre for Public Scrutiny's views, they weren't keen on that and didn't think it was particularly work well. I think that what I wanted to do through this was reassure members that there's no lack of focus on the budget through this corporate scrutiny committee. So in particular, as I've put into the report, we've got a really robust process for annual budget scrutiny. You know, we have a lot of task and finish groups. You know, we really work through that process. And that's actually been mapped into the the calendar of meetings from now on, so that wouldn't be going away. We would still have revenue budgets being looked at on a regular basis as well, as we would the other budgets. So no focus going away from that corporate committee, but what it does do is it builds in then the Children's Trust, which at the minute is separated between the Finance and Resources Committee and the Commission. So you're looking at it in 2 different committees, which can jar a little bit, so you're getting all of it into one place. So that's the Corporate Scrutiny Committee. In terms of panels, we have a number of panels ongoing right now, and there was some discussion in the Constitutional Review Working Group about how many we should have. So initially, when we set the work plan with the Centre for Public Scrutiny, we agreed on 3, and that was a really good number. That's actually been increased to 4 through these procedurals. So we've got an additional task and finish group as well moving forward. And also really good suggestion from the Constitutional Review Working Group about those long-standing panels. So we currently have one, which is our budget one, which I just described. We've also got another one, which is our outside bodies one, which we look at on an annual basis. So we review our outside bodies, get feedback from members, and determine which ones we would want to appoint members to in the future. So they would be excluded from that 4, so that you've still got a really good number to do that focused work and really get value from scrutiny. So looking generally at feedback, so moving to 4.19 of the report, there was feedback in relation to the political chairmanship of the committees, and that's a decision for council, but I've included that in the feedback because I received a number of comments about that. Also around a learning and development programme. So members are really keen that we get our members trained and have a really good programme. So I've been talking to the Centre for Public Scrutiny about that and what we can do and have a proper programme for when this comes into place and give members the skills and the expertise within these areas to continue to develop scrutiny. We had some comments about the effectiveness of executive advisory panels, which I've put into there, and that's subject to a separate review, but I've noted it. And then also there was some concern around the frequency of meetings in the Constitutional Review Working Group. It's been put into these procedurals around bi-monthly, but obviously if it's placed in bi-monthly, they can be added if they need to. So if additional meetings need to be included, then they're able to do that. And that's actually what happened after the first year of our scrutiny programme with the Commission. So we were on bi-monthly, I believe, and then we increased it to monthly due to the work plan. So same principle there. So in terms of the number of members, a figure of 9 has been included, except for health, which has 11 due to the statutory consultees, which we would add to the committees. But I've directed the committee to discuss that and decide if that's something that they would want to go ahead with. So the procedurals are included, as are the feedback from members and the feedback from the Centre for Public Scrutiny. I keep getting the name wrong, it's Governance and Scrutiny, they changed it a while ago. So I'm happy to take any comments and make any amendments, and obviously this would then be recommended to Council, so it'd be an all-member decision when we get to there.
Thank you very much. The first comment is on 9.1. I've discussed it with the leader, and it's said here in the second sentence, if the chair or vice chair resigns from the role prior to the next annual meeting, then a vote may be taken by the committee to replace him in the year. That is a function of the leader of the council because he appoints to start with. I can't hear you.
Sorry, could you tell me where that point was? I couldn't find...
Page 25.
Oh, thank you.
Yep, point 9.1.
It would be a decision of this committee, of the committee. It wouldn't. The committee would have to vote for the chair. So the leader may may choose somebody out of his group who he wants to chair. Yeah. The other groups may also put someone forward, and then we would do a vote in the committee. Yeah. So that would be the process.
I just wanted to clarify that that is happening. Then page 29. In the Constitution Working Group, we discussed on 16.4 the form. There's a magic form, and you were going to, or somebody was going to attach that, and the reference is also in 18.1 with the appropriate form. We don't know what that form is.
Madam Chair, those comments were minuted in the working group. It's not really for the procedural rules. That will be an operational side, but it has been minuted.
Okay, but because it says the appropriate form, we don't know what the appropriate form is. Nobody does.
Well, that doesn't have to be agreed by committee. It just needs to comply with what's required in the procedural rules.
Right. Okay.
I haven't answered you're looking
No,
at me, so...
Because what it said in 16.4, a request shall only be valid if it's signed by at least 8 members of the council who are not members of the exec. 8 separate emails as appropriate will be acceptable if the form has not been signed. Yeah, so it's making reference to a form.
With due respect, there is already a form that can be completed what we talked about at the group was ensuring that when my colleague sends out the decision notice after the executive meeting, he attaches a copy of the form as well for ease of use by members if they wish to call something in.
Yeah, but nobody knows where to find this form.
Well, we have had with due
something.
respect, Chair, we have had call-ins, so members have used the form. But I think the point that was made at the working group was that that should be, if you like, a standard operational issue. That when the decision notices go out, that attached to that is either a link or the form, so that members aren't hunting around looking for it. I think that was the point that was made at the working group. Councillor Mercer wishes to come in, Chair.
Yeah, Councillor Mercer.
Yes, I was at that working group, but since I've thought, that's only applicable if it's an executive decision, because you can call in an officer decision as well, or various other people. So, you know, I think if there was some easy method where members could see that. But I think the other point that was raised at that point was in 16.6, where it says the principles of decision making, which are outlined on that form. If at this point it actually listed the principles of decision making, I think that would be more complete. If failing that, it actually needs to say the paragraph number that you can find it at, because I wouldn't have a clue where to look.
Yes, Councillor Mercer, I did intend on doing that. That's just been missed. So we'll add the decision-making principles into there, and that will be fine. And just in terms of the other form, that's in place for the next executive meeting. So my colleague is doing that for me.
That's lovely. Are there any other comments? Councillor Fedorovich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a very quick point about the voting on the chair. So, I mean, it's been mentioned multiple times about opposition should having that opportunity to chair, or at least giving priority. Of course, if you could have that same sort of situation where both groups do put that forward, but if you have the opposition who has someone to put forward, then I think they should have the precedent, because it's all about trying to keep it as independent, and it's about independent scrutiny, isn't it? So that's sort of the priority. And then obviously if there isn't that option, then you can default to the administration.
Right. Thank you. Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to raise a couple of typographical things that are actually quite significant. I've already notified the monitoring officer. On page 24, 5.1, it says to fulfil all functions of the council in relation to blah, blah, blah. It should be all scrutiny functions, because there are executive functions included in that as well. And similarly in 5.2, to fulfil all scrutiny functions of the council's designated blah, 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 because once again, there are executive functions under that Act which cannot be fulfilled by a scrutiny committee. So those two things I've already notified the monitoring officer about. And the third one, 9.1, if the chair or vice chair resigns from the role prior to the next blah, 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 that needs to be extended, and it should be if the chair or vice chair leaves that role or something like that, because they could die, they could be disbarred as a councillor, they could cease to be able to... Yeah. So
I agree, leaves is better.
Yeah.
Chair, if we change that to something, if a vacancy occurs in the position of chair or vice chair, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely perfect. Any other comments from anybody? Councillor Jill Mercer, sorry.
Under co-optees, as
which paragraph?
Paragraph 7 in the page 25. We've got several different types of consultees. Under parent governor representatives, it says will be appointed. I mean, the other two say shall or can. I don't think it's an essential you have to appoint someone. I think it's can.
Maybe appointed.
Parent governor representatives can be appointed. And I think that also ought to have in that they would then be involved when education is discussed, because it wouldn't be appropriate otherwise. Coming back to this thorny question of numbers of members, you mentioned that it said 11 if they're co-optees, but that's not what it says. It just says there'll be 9 elected members. It doesn't say about, because in the suggestion of, I think it was 4.24, you said, or 11 for health scrutiny because they're co-optees. So I think that's missing from there. Again, I think we perhaps need to think about the quorum, but actually it just says the quorum shall be. I think that needs to be the quorum of the scrutiny committees, because it's
Sorry,
you know,
which
sorry,
item?
that's 10.1. The quorum of the scrutiny committee shall be. Okay. And 11.2, extraordinary meetings can be called, but it doesn't say who by. So I would suggest by the chairman of the committee, because, you know, unless you suggest otherwise, but, you know, I would think it has to say who can call one of them. And several other places where it's things like reports come back to, it seems to always assume that they're executive things, and it's not necessarily
They
health.
are all executive. So
Yeah.
even if it's an officer decision, it's an executive function.
No, I was thinking that health might be a report about hospital or something like that. It's not necessarily about the executive. So I think it needs...
It's still an executive function, though.
Is it? Does it always go then to the executive? The
No,
report?
it's not about it going to the executive. It's about it either being an executive function or a council function. So decisions are either council functions or they're executive functions. So it's about it being an executive function.
Right. So if there was a report about something to do with health, that would still be either an executive or a council function, would it?
It would be, yeah, an executive function.
It's just, I thought, just so for completeness, it might need to say that anything other than executive decisions should go to council, but, you know, I stand corrected. On the number of panels, I was just wondering, something like the asset rationalisation, which a couple of us are on, that's a long-standing panel. I mean, we've been for months now. Would that count as a long-standing panel?
I still think that would be task and finish, because even though you're not doing it in, you know, a short period of time in terms of, you know, a few weeks or a few months, you're still reaching an end goal on it. So it's very much, you know, task and finish.
Right.
So you would set that out in that way.
Yeah. In which case I would think that 4 is not sufficient, because you're saying 4 between 3 committees. I would have thought it was probably better to leave that a bit more open to the Scrutiny Management Board, thinking that something is necessary rather than being so prescriptive. I mean, it probably won't be as many as 4, but it's just the Scrutiny Management Board are saying whether it's necessary or not.
I think wouldn't it come back if there's a necessity to increase the amount of panels, the individual committee would come back?
It would then go to the Scrutiny Management Board, and they would then look at whether there's exceptional circumstances as to why you've got more than 4 panels. I suppose that what we have to think about is the resource implications of that as well. So we've then got 3 committees, a Scrutiny Management Board, we've got 4 panels, we've got 2 long-standing panels, and we've got a limited democratic services team to support that. So honestly, in terms of resource, we would struggle to do any more than that, I think. So then we would have to look at the resource implications. And that's an okay consideration to have, is that we might then think, actually, we've got 4, but this one isn't as much of a priority. So let's stand that one down for a bit and let's move on to that one, because that's a particularly urgent piece of work. So it's just about prioritisation of what you're actually putting your efforts into. It's also about the amount of members that you've got. So if you've got loads of different panels going off, then actually you can lose focus. So you want members to really focus on a panel, get to the finish of it, and then move on to the next one. You can have a lot going on, and it can really lose that value.
You're saying 4 across all 3. It's not 4 per committee, is it?
No, 4 across all 3.
Yeah.
But I meant you've got 3 committees, you've got one Scrutiny Management Board, 4 panels.
Misunderstood, it's mentioned about co-optees. I just wondered, do they come, are they a paid position? Do they come on as independents, or is that got to be taken into account?
No, there's no mention of them in the remuneration panels and recommendations, so they wouldn't be, no.
There's a mention here, panels are not required to be politically balanced, but they should be cross-party. I can't remember seeing that about the main committees. Is that just prescribed, though, so it doesn't need to be said?
No, so they could be, but because they're informal groups, the way that we've managed scrutiny so far is that we've had cross-party rather than it being politically balanced. So typically we've had 7 members as part of a panel. We've had 4 Conservatives, 2 Labour and 1 Green Alliance. So that's just the way that it's been managed.
I was just meaning for the scrutiny committees.
Oh, they would be politically balanced.
They would anyway.
Oh, absolutely, politically balanced.
We don't have to put it in here. That's
No.
Yeah, okay. And with the call-in can potentially be for officers as well. I just wondered what if we've got this number of days after, that's perhaps a little bit more difficult with the officer decision, or is it still published in the same way so that there will be a decision published and then call in that many days after that?
So this is only for key decisions, so it wouldn't be all decisions. So a key decision, over £500,000, significant impact on 2 or more wards. I'd expect a decision notice to be drafted for that. So a decision notice, in the same way that we make decisions in the executive, we would then do a decision notice. It would be sent out in the usual way, so all members would be aware, and then we would seek to implement. So really similar process to what it is if you're making an executive decision in the meeting.
Okay. At 16.9, you've got notifying members if deciding upon the validity of a call-in. There's no time frame mentioned there. Is it necessity to say within 5 working days or whatever?
But it says before the 5 days.
No, once it's found invalid and it's notified to the members who called it in, or the leader, or I think it was the leader and the executive member, etc. Is there any need to perhaps put in the time frame they need to be informed about it? Yeah, I was thinking more of ones that are found invalid, but I suppose the same would apply for if it's found valid.
Yeah, I suppose the difficulty around that is that if you get a call-in request, it may be that during that period of time I work with members around that call-in request and we have conversations to and from, for example. So it could restrict that, but I don't mind having a time frame in there to notify them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any more points? That's it. Councillor Addison.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question is around co-optees as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, there doesn't seem to be an independent member on the corporate scrutiny panel. Why is that when it would be useful to have, say, somebody from the business sector or something sitting there, even if it's in a non-voting role?
We've only included statutory consultees in here, so the ones that are derived from legislation that we're informed that we have to. If we were moving to the panel work, which is the conversation that we actually had in the Constitutional Review Working Group, we'd probably have more independent members in there. So I gave an example, for example, at one of my previous authorities in a town centre where we had the Chamber for Commerce, we had local business owners, we had lots of different people from the tourist sector, and then we brought that expertise together. So I'm used to seeing it more in the panels for specific piece of work where you can use their expertise, but we've just included statutory, co-optees for this purpose, and that's the reason why.
Okay. Councillor Maxwell.
Well, I'd like to say I'm really pleased that you're going to invite the public to these meetings, and I think that's good. Are you thinking of actually putting this meeting on Zoom so that people can see it rather than having to come in?
they have always been public, the scrutiny meetings, scrutiny committees, and they are live streamed like all the other
They are?
meetings. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
The panel meetings aren't. So the more informal working groups aren't streamed, but the main committee meetings, the Commission and Finance Resources are streamed, yeah.
Okay. Councillor Buckingham.
One of the things that we raised in the Constitutional Working Group was the need for an executive protocol, and I can't see that in there, and I think it does need to be in there, please. Thank you.
I've not put it into the procedurals, but I absolutely understand that in the statutory guidance we do need an executive scrutiny protocol. So I said that's one of the first things that the Scrutiny Management Board would undertake. I wonder if it's worth, if members would be so inclined, would be to put into the Scrutiny Management Board terms of reference to agree the executive scrutiny protocol, and then they can keep it under constant review, because it is that strategic oversight, isn't it? So it makes sense to go in there.
Councillor Andy Mercer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Going back to 11.2, extraordinary special meetings of the Scrutiny Committee or the Scrutiny Management Board may be called. I think that should be by either the chairman or the monitoring officer, because there are circumstances under which the CLT might want to have a committee called at short notice.
Do you agree with that? Yeah. Okay. Okay, Councillor Watt.
Thanks, Chair. We talk about call-ins of key decisions, but recently on scrutiny we've wanted to a review of performance of departments. Is that formalised, or is that just an extension of the call-in? I see there's on 1.3 it says question executive members about decisions and performance of their portfolio. Is that covered under that? But how do you get the executive member portfolio in front of you? What's the formal process? Thanks.
Yeah, so that's not call-in, that's more about agenda management. So you're absolutely right. So in those terms of reference, it says that you can bring executive members in. So in the situation where you look at your performance data, you think that something's not quite as it should, you'd like to investigate it a little bit more, you can call the executive member in, and we can put that on the agenda, and then we can talk about that performance. So that Scrutiny Management Board is meeting, regularly. They're meeting monthly, and so they're constantly looking at the forward plan, they're looking at performance data, they're looking at all these different things. So what you'd say is, as part of that, is the committee is saying to me that I want to, saying to us that we need to review that performance, let's put it on the agenda for the next meeting, and then you set it through that agenda setting.
Okay, Councillor Maxwell.
Well, I was going to say, following the last scrutiny meeting, right, which was quite sort of like heated, yes, is there a possibility whereby if a meeting becomes heated, that I'm just trying to think of the words actually, that you actually say that either it's not relevant or you shouldn't be having a heated meeting. I think you've got to somehow stop meetings where you've got people probably being quite...
I think chairman will do that automatically.
Yeah.
It happened earlier on, if you recall, and meetings will be called to proper order.
Yeah,
and
I
if
think
not,
that-
the
yeah, I think
monitoring
that's what I
officer
was
will
trying to- yeah.
will certainly call for it, or the committee officer.
Yeah, there is provision in the Constitution as well in terms of meeting procedure rules around that we can call into order as well. But what you don't want to discourage is robust debate, but you do still want to make sure that it's in order. And if all members want to come to standards training on Thursday, then they would hear more about this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it was just that the fact that one particular person, who I will not name, was quite, I would say, disparaging towards something.
Well, if anything like that happens and you feel that somebody has been disparaging, disrespectful to officers, or whatever, then there's always the opportunity to speak with the monitoring officer, and the monitoring officer will speak to that particular person in the first instance. And if that is not resolved, then you can always use the standards complaint.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Jill Mercer.
There's a budget for scrutiny. I don't know if is that something that the Scrutiny Management Board would need to manage to say, you know, well, have we got enough resources? You know, is that something that perhaps ought to go in on the list of...
A cup of tea?
I'm not sure.
Cup of tea? Thinking money rather than cups of tea.
Difficult questions.
I mean, take
Just
that
a
away.
second. Just a second. You're phoning a friend.
Sorry, yeah. I'm asking Paul because it's his budget, so he's the budget manager on it.
Sorry? No, it was just a thought that, you know, if the Scrutiny Management Board knew, well, we've got X amount, you know, that we can spend, and can we add this extra item on that agenda, or can we put an extra panel on? Is it going to have a resource implication, etc., or is it just going to be the officers that would manage that?
Well, in terms of the budget, I mean, I have a members' training budget, which obviously going forward, hopefully through the guidance of the Council of Development and Training Group, will identify the training needs of members, and that will obviously include scrutiny as well within that, because members, as you know, were encouraged to fill in their training needs analysis. So there will be money set aside for scrutiny training. In terms of panel work, that would just have to be met out of existing budgets somewhere. It depends on what you're actually referring to. I haven't known. Oh, sorry.
There is a scrutiny budget. That was
Sorry?
there is a scrutiny budget, isn't there? I don't know if that...
There was. In the initial independent remuneration panel's recommendations, they suggested that we had a small amount of money for panel work so that we could provide chairs with extra chairing responsibilities if we needed to. So I think, Councillor Mercer, what you're asking is whether that should be allocated through that Scrutiny Management Board.
I was thinking particularly when I was on the Scrutiny Committee in the past, where we had a task and finish group, and we actually hired an independent person to help us, a consultant, and then we actually went out on site visits to see different places, and obviously that takes money. So it was just that sort of budget that's specifically for scrutiny, not some training, but you know, of the actual workload. That's what I was thinking. I just wondered if that needed to go in as an item on the terms of reference. That's all.
I think that could just go, when the panel's created, I think that could just be a conversation between members and the scrutiny officer about the budget available. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from anybody, or are we all done? I think we are. In that case, can we turn to the recommendation on page 4? Are we all in agreement with those recommendations? And if so, if somebody can propose and second it? Councillor Mercer proposes.
With the amendments that have been agreed?
Yes, of course, with the amendments. You'll second it. All in favour, please show. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. With that, I close the meeting at 22:12. Thank you very much. And please put into your diary, there's very important standards training on Thursday of this week at 6 o'clock.
It's 6 o'clock. And it's not just like training, it's conversations and discussion about where we're at as a unitary and standards, etc. So, and I've got an external facilitator coming in who's really good. So please, can you prioritise it?
So thank you very much and have a safe journey home.
Chairman, you said 20 to